The Second World War did not begin on the morning when German troops crossed into Poland. That moment, dramatic as it was, represented the end of a long process rather than its beginning. The true origins of the war lie years earlier in diplomatic offices, private meetings, and confidential agreements that were never intended for public scrutiny. What followed in 1939 was not a sudden collapse of peace, but the final consequence of choices already made. In the years after the First World War, Europe struggled to rebuild itself from devastation. Economies were fragile, political systems unstable, and entire societies traumatized by loss on a scale never before experienced. The peace settlements imposed at the end of the war were designed to prevent another global conflict, yet they carried within them the seeds of future instability. Germany, in particular, emerged from the war not only defeated but deeply humiliated. Its military was restricted, its territory reduced, and its economy burdened by reparations that proved impossible to sustain. At the same time, a different fear was taking hold across the continent. The Russian Revolution had demonstrated that established political orders could be overturned entirely. To many governments in Western Europe, the spread of communism appeared more dangerous than a resentful Germany. Maintaining order, even if it required compromise, became the overriding priority. In this climate of anxiety, the enforcement of international agreements began to weaken. Publicly, world leaders spoke of peace and cooperation. Privately, they questioned how much pressure Germany could endure before collapsing into chaos or radicalism. As German leaders began to challenge the restrictions imposed upon them, these actions were often met with caution rather than resistance. Rearmament proceeded gradually, sometimes openly, sometimes disguised through technical loopholes or foreign cooperation. Intelligence services were aware of these developments, but decisive responses were consistently delayed. Diplomacy during this period was marked less by firm opposition than by negotiation and accommodation. Agreements were reached that allowed limited violations of earlier treaties in exchange for promises of restraint. These arrangements were rarely formalized in a single document. Instead, they took the form of assurances, understandings, and strategic silence. Each concession was justified as a necessary step to preserve stability and avoid war. Small nations, meanwhile, found their futures discussed without their participation. Their sovereignty became a subject of negotiation rather than a principle to be defended. Borders drawn after the First World War were reconsidered not on the basis of self-determination, but of convenience. The assumption underlying these discussions was that satisfying certain demands would prevent larger conflicts. In reality, each compromise altered the balance of power. As Germany's position strengthened, so too did its confidence. Diplomatic successes reinforced the belief that international opposition lacked resolve, demands increased in scale, and the language of negotiation grew more assertive. Yet even then, many leaders believed that continued dialogue could prevent catastrophe. They underestimated how deeply the logic of force had already taken hold. The most striking example of this miscalculation came when two ideological enemies, publicly hostile and seemingly irreconcilable, entered into a private agreement. This arrangement, shocking to observers, was based not on trust but on mutual advantage. Each side sought security in the short term, believing it could manage the consequences later. In doing so, they removed the final obstacle to open conflict. Once this understanding was reached, the diplomatic structure that had sustained the illusion of peace collapsed. Military plans that had been prepared in advance were activated with precision. To the public, the outbreak of war appeared sudden and dramatic. To those familiar with the preceding negotiations, it was the expected result of years of calculated compromise. World War II was not the product of diplomatic failure alone. It was the result of diplomacy used as a tool to delay confrontation rather than prevent aggression. The secret deals that preceded the war were attempts to control events quietly without public accountability. Instead, they ensured that when war finally came, it would arrive with a force beyond anyone's ability to contain. The agreements that had been made in secrecy did not end with the avoidance of conflict. They reshaped the international order in ways that could no longer be reversed. Once the principle of collective resistance was abandoned, each state began to calculate its own survival independently. Trust between nations weakened, and alliances that had been presented as firm guarantees revealed themselves to be fragile arrangements based on convenience rather than commitment. When military action finally began, it exposed the consequences of years of diplomatic hesitation. Several states discovered that the assurances they had relied upon carried no real obligation. The promises of protection that had been offered publicly were quietly set aside when they became inconvenient. Strategic priorities changed overnight, and moral commitments were subordinated to military realities. The speed with which territory changed hands stunned the world. What appeared to be bold and unexpected military success was, in reality, the result of long preparation combined with diplomatic paralysis. Defensive plans had been delayed or abandoned because leaders believed that negotiations would continue. When those negotiations failed, there was no time left to adapt. Behind the front lines, the collapse of earlier agreements created confusion and mistrust. Governments that had cooperated only months earlier now viewed each other as potential threats. Neutrality, once seen as a shield, became increasingly difficult to maintain. Economic pressures, military demands, and political instability forced states to choose sides, often against their own long-term interests. The irony of the secret deals became increasingly clear as the war expanded. Agreements intended to limit conflict instead ensured that it spread. By attempting to localize aggression and direct it away from themselves, those who had negotiated in private had made a general war unavoidable. Each compromise narrowed the range of peaceful options until none remained. As the conflict intensified, former partners found themselves trapped by their own calculations. The temporary advantages gained through secret understandings vanished under the demands of total war. Resources were strained, populations mobilized, and economies reshaped entirely around survival. The carefully balanced diplomacy of the pre-war years proved irrelevant in a world defined by force. The war also revealed the limits of strategic cynicism. Leaders who had believed they could control outcomes through selective engagement discovered that violence follows its own logic. Once unleashed, it could not be confined to predetermined borders or schedules. The very instability they had sought to avoid became a defining feature of the conflict. Within occupied territories and contested regions, the human cost of these decisions became undeniable. Entire populations were displaced, economies destroyed, and social structures dismantled. For those living under occupation, the secret agreements that had shaped their fate were invisible, yet their consequences were immediate and brutal. The war was no longer an abstract geopolitical struggle, but a daily reality of loss and uncertainty. As alliances shifted and battle lines hardened, the original justifications for compromise lost credibility. Preventing war was no longer possible. Winning it became the sole objective. Diplomatic efforts continued, but now they focused on coordination rather than prevention. The language of restraint was replaced by the language of necessity. By the midpoint of the war, it was evident that the diplomatic framework of the interwar period had failed completely. Institutions created to preserve peace had been undermined by the very states responsible for sustaining them. International law, once seen as a safeguard against aggression, was revealed to be dependent on the willingness of powerful nations to enforce it. The secret deals that had once promised stability were now viewed as symbols of misjudgment. They had delayed resistance when resistance was most effective. They had granted legitimacy to actions that should have been challenged early, and they had taught aggressors that pressure, when applied consistently, would be rewarded. When the war finally ended, the full scale of its destruction forced a reckoning with the decisions that had preceded it. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and entire regions faced the task of rebuilding from almost nothing. In this environment, it became impossible to ignore the role that pre-war diplomacy had played in shaping the catastrophe. The documents that emerged after the conflict revealed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The war had not been inevitable in the abstract. It had become inevitable through a series of deliberate choices made under pressure, guided by fear and justified by the desire to avoid immediate conflict. Each decision appeared rational in isolation. Together they proved disastrous. What distinguished these secret deals was not merely their content, but their method. They were conducted without public accountability, often bypassing legislative oversight and popular consent. Leaders acted on the assumption that secrecy would grant them flexibility. Instead, it removed the possibility of correction. Without public scrutiny, flawed assumptions went unchallenged until it was too late. The post-war international order was shaped in response to these failures. New institutions were created with the explicit aim of preventing a return to secret diplomacy and unilateral decision-making. Collective security, transparency, and shared responsibility became central principles, at least in theory. The memory of how easily peace had been undermined remained fresh, yet the lessons of the war were not universally applied. The temptation to resolve crises quietly through private arrangements rather than open negotiation did not disappear. The belief that stability can be purchased through compromise with aggression continues to resurface in different forms. History suggests that such approaches carry inherent risks. World War II stands as a reminder that peace cannot be sustained through silence alone. Agreements made without accountability may delay conflict, but they rarely resolve its causes. When power is allowed to operate without restraint, it reshapes the international system in ways that are difficult to reverse. The secret deals that preceded the war were not acts of ignorance. They were acts of calculation made by individuals who believed they were acting responsibly under difficult circumstances. Their failure lies not in intent but in assumption, the assumption that force can be managed, that ambition can be satisfied, and that moral compromises can remain contained. In the end, the war demonstrated a simple but enduring truth. Conflicts of such scale are rarely the result of sudden madness. They emerge gradually, shaped by decisions that prioritize short-term stability over long-term justice. When those decisions are hidden from view, their consequences become far more dangerous. The origins of the Second World War remind us that history is not only shaped by what is done openly, but by what is agreed upon quietly, and that the most consequential moments often occur long before the world realizes that a crisis has begun.